Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National D-Day Memorial's Lunchbox Lecture. We are so delighted to have you tuning in today, and we're going to be talking about, I think, an absolutely fascinating topic of World War II, which was how did they get all of that mail to everyone during the war. We're going to learn more here in just a moment. To tell us about it, I am so happy today that we have a wonderful friend and colleague with us, Jim Triesler, who is the Director of Education at the Virginia War Memorial. And let me just say, and I know Jim will tell us a little bit more about the Virginia War Memorial. If you've never been in Richmond, Virginia, it is absolutely stunningly beautiful and a really moving tribute that I hope everyone will take some time to go see if you have not seen it. I had the privilege of serving on the board of directors there. It's just something that everyone, particularly if you're in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but outside of the Commonwealth as well, it's a beautifully done memorial with many additions that I know Jim will mention here in just a moment. So today we do have with us Jim Triesler, and as I mentioned, he is not only the Director of Education at the Virginia War Memorial, but he's also a historian for the National Battle of the Bulge Association. Jim has been educating and entertaining students for over 25 years, and he and his students were the recipients of a Save Our History Award from the History Channel for their work towards preserving thousands of letters written between World War II soldiers and their loved ones. So he has a real love of this topic as well. Jim has worked to preserve the legacy of World War II veterans by conducting over 200 interviews. He's traveled to 9 different countries in Europe to visit the beaches, towns, and battlefields where our soldiers once fought. And in 2007, he was the Virginia Region 1 Teacher of the Year, and in 2012, the Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge Person of the Year. And we're so honored to have you with us here today, Jim. Thank you for all you do.
Well, April, it's great to be here today. Thank you so much. And especially thank you for the opportunity to talk about a topic that I just truly love. And that is, the mail, letters during World War II. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. We're just going to let you take it away, Jim, and
okay.
Tell us more.
Well, before we talk about the mail, I think it's important that I show you at least a few pictures of the Virginia War Memorial. So this is our campus, and we now have 2 shrines. They're actually, I suppose the newer shrine you would say is really an extension of the first shrine. But if you look at this photograph of our campus, on the left is our original 1956 shrine that opened to honor those Virginians who gave their lives in combat during World War II and the Korean War. Now, once Vietnam happened, they extended the shrine to cover those Virginians who died during Vietnam and then during the Persian Gulf. But after that, the shrine had filled up. So over on the far right, we have an extension with a new shrine that opened last year, and that is our 21st century shrine that covers those names from those who have sacrificed their lives during the global war on terror. Now, we're much more than a memorial. In the middle, we have the Galante Education Center. We have museum galleries. We have meeting spaces. We have an archives, lots and lots of stuff. And we do education programs for people of all ages. So if you'd like to learn more, I hope you'll visit our website here at the Virginia War Memorial. Now, this is what the original 20th century shrine looks like. That's the Statue of Memory down at the end. She's 30 feet tall and represents those women who lost loved ones during the wars. And you can see there on the left, names are engraved in glass. On the right, they're engraved in stone. And again, they are organized by city and county. And every single location, including Bedford, is represented here in our memorial from around the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is a gorgeous picture that was taken of the sunrise. You can see the Richmond skyline. That tall building in the center is the Federal Reserve Bank, if you were wondering. And the sun comes up on the James River as we overlook the James. And it's just a gorgeous place. Sunrise, sunset, any time of day. We're in one of the most beautiful places in all of Richmond. So I hope people will come and visit us. Our mission is to honor veterans, preserve history, educate youth, and inspire patriotism in all. So let's talk about mail during World War II. Again, I'm Jim Triesler, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Virginia War Memorial. Now, I wanted to start by looking at a letter that I have here on my desk right now, actually. And it was written by Private William Richard Roberts Jr. of the 319th Infantry, which was part of the 80th Infantry Division during World War II. And this is a group photo. It is intentionally blurred with a clear image of Private Roberts there in the center. And Private Roberts wrote the following to his wife on December 2nd, 1944. And he's in France. And he says, "My darling wife, how are you by now? Sugar, I am okay, I suppose. Sugar, it's very unusual for me to get to write 2 days right straight along. But every chance I get, you can bet I will let you know that I'm still okay. Sugar, I received a very pretty Christmas card from Dr. Lane. It sure makes anybody feel good to get mail over here. In fact, that is all you have to look forward to." This is why I wanted to lead off with that letter. I wanted to get to that part where he said how much soldiers look forward to mail. And he's saying, again, that is all you have to look forward to. Just a week ago, I was with some Battle of the Bulge veterans down in Charleston, South Carolina, and I asked them, what would you rather have, food or mail from home? And overwhelmingly, they said they'd rather have mail from home than food. So you know how important mail was. Well, here's a picture of the letter that I was just reading there on the right. And he says at the very end here that he hasn't received any of his Christmas boxes. And I think that's really important to know, because there was a huge backup, which is only going to get worse in a few weeks, because on December 16th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge is going to begin. So he says, I have very little to write about today. So he's going to close. He says, you just keep right on smiling and don't worry, because it can't last always. Bye-bye, darling, your loving husband, Richard. So he went by his middle name, Richard. And now this is the envelope that the letter came in. And this is important for us because it's in the upper corner there. It has his return address. And at this point in time, he was with Company D, 319th Infantry, and it says APO 80, Postmaster, care of Postmaster, New York, New York. And he's writing to his wife, who at that time lived in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can see that it was set as airmail. Now, this is important. Regular soldiers' mail was free. And you would just write free in the upper corner where the stamp went. But if you wanted something special like airmail, you had to put a 6-cent stamp on it. And you can see down at the bottom, again, it says, airmail. And the censor stamp, it's been signed by a major in the infantry in this case. And that means, that it's been read, it passed the censor, nothing was cut out of it. But what's so important is that APO address, the American Post Office. And again, it's number 80. Now, if mail was going to Europe, it said New York, New York. So basically it went through New York City. If it was going to somewhere in the Pacific, it would say San Francisco. So in this case, if the enemy had captured this letter, they would have no idea beyond New York, New York, where he was located. And the government kept track of the APO addresses, so they would be able to track APO 80 and then deliver the mail to Private Roberts. So this is a booklet that, I imagine they would have killed for during World War II, but it came out after 1947, and it was a list of all the war APO addresses. So it's the numerical listing of the APOs. And the page that's here on the right is the page that references APO 80 through New York. And I just gave you a segment of it. And what's on the far right are the dates when they would have relocated. So for example, the 80th Infantry, if you look at, it says 2/12/44 on the right. So that's actually the 2nd of December, 1944. And they're in Saint Avold, France. So that's where they're located. And you can see here, they moved a lot and quite often. So they eventually were in France, went into Luxembourg, and by March 19th, they have moved into Germany. And you can continue to follow them right up till the end of the war. So here's a map showing where that is. And it just happens that St. Avold is the site of, would have been future for him, but the Lorraine American Cemetery and Memorial. So our very large, beautiful cemetery for our World War II veterans who were killed is located right there where he's writing from. Now, this is east of Metz, France, and many of the soldiers that are buried there were killed in action fighting at Metz. And what's really important is just above St. Avold, there is a black line weaving through, and that black line is the border with Germany. So they are right there at the border of Germany when he's writing this letter on December 2nd. Now, he didn't have a lot to say, and he did mention he was amazed he could write 2 days in a row. And I went back to the after action reports, and this is just a little clip from it to get an idea of what he was experiencing. So the city of St. Avold was captured on November 27th, 1944. So just a few days before he's writing this letter. And what's important is that it says the last of the Germans fled close to midnight, the night of the 26th and 27th of November, but not without doing considerable damage with demolitions. About 6 enemy engineers had placed heavy charges under the town post office, the main crossroad, and a culvert in the town square, in addition to several other relatively important crossroads and culverts within the city. Well, not only that, they placed, we came to find out, up to 30 time bombs. They had timers on them throughout the city, including in some of the homes that existed there. And many of them were discovered that week, but on the day that he's writing, none of the time bombs had gone off yet on December 2nd. But all the soldiers were on edge because they knew there were time bombs hidden all over the place. It turns out that several of them that they discovered had a timer set for December 3rd, the very next day after the letter was written. And sure enough, on December 3rd, 5 of the time bombs went off, 22 soldiers were killed. Now, our soldier who wrote the letter was not killed. He actually came home and lived into the 1960s. But it just shows that, soldiers, due to censorship requirements, couldn't really tell what was going on. And he was in a town and was experiencing all this tension because of time bombs that were hidden throughout the town of St. Avold. Here's a picture of the Lorraine American Military Cemetery that, again, existed after the war, very close there to where he was writing from with the 80th Infantry Division. So what were some of the instructions for writing letters? The government was really good about issuing instructions. So they told people at home, write briefly and write often. And, the soldiers, a lot of times, they didn't have much to say, but just receiving a letter from them that said, I'm okay, was enough, that you knew they were still alive, that they were doing all right. Now, they were encouraged to write, and this was true for soldiers too, encouraged to write on only one side of the paper. And that was because of censorship. The soldiers' letters were supposed to be censored. Letters from home were not censored, but the soldiers' letters were. So if you wrote on both sides of the paper, as we're going to see shortly, you would have lost a lot more if one word was cut out on one side of the paper. So you had to address the mail properly. You had to include your APO address and always use your return address. And the government stressed that you should write about things the soldier wants to hear about: family, sports. They said, do not complain about things he can't help you with. If you complain that the car's not running, then he's just going to want to come home and help you, or that the furnace has gone out. He's going to want to come home. He needs to focus on the difficult job that he had ahead, not worry about you at home. So what they would say is in the letters, you're again, talk about sports. Let your neighbor be the one to help you with the car that's not running or with the furnace. Don't worry your soldier with things like that. Now, of course, people still did worry their soldiers, but generally they were encouraged not to. So one of my favorite letters is from Colonel Sid Wells. This is Colonel Wells in the photograph here. And he was in a chemical mortar battalion. And he wrote on December 8th, 1941, the very day after the war began. He was already in the Army. And he says to his fiancée, "Darling, I saw something today I'll remember as long as I live. There were about 30 or 40 of us lying around or sitting around the pay room listening to the president's speech. When it was over, they played the Star-Spangled Banner. You should have seen that room. As a single man, we all rose to our feet and stood at attention. Every back was still and every chin was firm. Not a word was spoken. And in some eyes, There were tears of emotion. And that was the president's speech about the declaration of war. So he goes on in that same letter and writes, I'm going to do my best to try and get a furlough and get home to see you, which he did close to Christmas time. And he said, it'll probably be the last one I will get for a very long time. Pray that I get my furlough and that I see you once more before I leave. And now here's the important thing. Red, which was the nickname for his girlfriend, he said, Red, and her name was Anne, Red, I still want to marry you even more now than I ever have before, but I can't marry you now, darling. It won't be fair to you if I do. I love you, Anne, and I always shall as long as I live, but there is no use fooling ourselves. We are at war, and I might not come back, and I don't want to leave you a widow, maybe with a child. So he's very concerned. He's breaking off their engagement. And in the final part of his letter, he says, are you going to keep on loving me, or are you going to forget about me when we are shipped away? I can imagine how you are worrying right now, but don't worry, everything will turn out all right. In another week or so, we should be able to tell whether or not we are going to get a furlough or not. And he closes with, I love you, Red, and I want to marry you, but there's the chance of not coming back or coming back a cripple, and I don't want to burden you. That is the last thing I want to do. Sweetheart, you and you alone will be the only woman in my heart as long as I live. I will come back to you, Red. Never fear. Yours always, Sydney. And I like to share this letter because, for one, it showed that our soldiers were suddenly, thrust into war, and they were ready for war. One of the things he writes to Anne is that he says, yesterday this was a game, but today it is real. And this really shows the strain that was put on relationships. These soldiers are going off for the duration. And here he is, writing and saying, I can't marry you. Now, what's interesting is they did get married. When he came home on his furlough, Anne had arranged for their wedding, and they got married anyway. And not only did they have several children, but as time went on, they would have 14 great-grandchildren. So they lived a nice, long life. It worked out for them. Now, I want to talk about kisses for a second, which is kind of interesting. Life magazine in 1942 had an article about kisses, and this is just one of the pages. There were multiple pages that showed different styles of kissing, and that each one of these kisses, if you do it in the right way, the right shape, would have a certain message to it. So it's kind of funny. At the end, it would show 3 kisses together, all in different shapes. And that was supposed to mean, I love you, the 3 different kisses. So here's a letter that we were working on in my classroom with our It Took a War project. And you can see there's lipstick right there on the top. And this particular lady frequently kissed her letters. And I was very impressed that, after 75 years, the lipstick stayed very vibrant. So let's talk about censorship for a minute. This is a letter from Pete Sevestanock, and he wrote to his sisters in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and his letters often didn't get through without a few cuts. So here you can see the censor cut out a section. He says, a fellow from, and we'll never know because it's been removed, told me he only had 3 eggs for breakfast in 6 months. So that must have given away some information that would tell where they had been located. Now remember, censorship was instituted to increase the safety of our troops and help our military better achieve its goals. There was a concern by the government that letters written by our soldiers might fall into the hands of the enemy and thus reveal information detrimental to our cause. You remember the famous poster, loose lips sink ships. So not only, the verbal, but also the written word could be very dangerous. Although people back at home wanted to know where their loved ones were located overseas, soldiers were not permitted to include their specific location. Any mention of the lack of food or supplies was also prohibited. And of course, no battle plans could be discussed. Every letter was to be read by an officer before it was mailed, and if any offending passages were discovered, they were cut out or blacked out by the censor. Some soldiers would include secret messages in their letters, and these were often referred to as family codes. And we're going to take a look at one of those shortly. Those codes were discouraged by the government, but a lot of people use them. I know my mother is in her mid-80s, and she still likes to know where I am. So imagine if your son is off at war, or your daughter, but is off overseas, you're going to want to know where they are. So people would use secret codes sometimes in their letters. But a little more about censorship. Clendon Pleasance wrote this. This is in our collection here at the War Memorial. And you can see the censor had a field day with his, and he didn't follow the rules, not only the rules of censorship, but the suggestion that you write only on one side of the paper. So if we flip it over, we can see that the other side got pretty torn up too. Again, because one side was cut out, it damages both sides of the paper. So we mentioned family codes, and this is an article that appeared in a newspaper in 1943, and it said efforts to smuggle information through military channels are made by persons who do not stop to consider the loss of life and property that might result when their knowledge to reach an enemy agent. If the enemy captures this, you're endangering not just yourself, but everyone, that's in your infantry unit or on your ship. Family codes are so-called are frequently used by servicemen in correspondence with families and friends to let those at home know where they are stationed and what they are doing. And they did say, look, the Japanese and the Germans are much smarter than you give them credit for. They will break your family codes and you will endanger the lives of our servicemen. So this letter, it's a little grainy here, but this is an example of a family code. The paragraph on the right comes out of the full letter that's on the left, and it says, don't forget how I told you to know where I am when you get a letter. He says, take the first letter of every sentence, and that will spell it out. Wow, the first letter of every sentence. That's not a very difficult code. I have a feeling our enemies might have figured that one out. He did a test letter, and we were able to discover at that time he was in training in Florida because each sentence spelled out Florida with the first letter. Fred Whirl, I want to take a look at some letters and what people were saying, what they thought about. And Fred Whirl is actually my father-in-law, and he would marry Mary Tarrin, and that's my mother-in-law. And they're both gone now. They're up in Arlington Cemetery, but he was with the 75th Infantry in the Field Artillery. And he wrote on December 16th, which just happened to be the day that the Battle of the Bulge started, just a few lines to let you know I'm feeling fine and everything is all right with me. And again, that's really what soldiers wanted to let you know. Now the censor let this sentence get through. He says, I'm now somewhere in France, but I guess that was vague enough that they let it slide. He wasn't specific on where in France. And he had a few minutes to write. He says, darling, I love you with all my heart. And gee, I sure do miss you so very much. And he just asks how everyone is. Take care of yourself because I love you so much. I sure will be happy when the war is ended so I can come home to you. I love you so very, very much. Send my regards to the family and all down at work. Love, Daddy. And James Goodwin with the 15th Air Force writing on February 8th, 1945 to his Valentine. Her name was Elizabeth. And he says, how's my Valentine tonight? Only 6 days, I received your sweet Valentine card today, and it made me feel so good inside to know there's such a sweet and beautiful girl at home who cares enough to lighten any man's heart. And James Goodwin is in this photo with his crew on the right. He's kneeling in the front. And on February 13th, the day before Valentine's Day, he wrote, I now have 14 missions, having finally gotten off the Jinx, which was the 13th mission. My last one was to Vienna again. We'll really have some experiences to tell you about when I see you again. Because again, with censorship, they couldn't really share that much information. Some quotes from other letters about censorship, which is interesting. Someone named Ziegler wrote in December 1942, of course there are things I am unable to write, which makes it very hard to write a letter. But nevertheless, you all have a good idea of near about where I am. So it doesn't make much difference because I'm unable to tell you. I imagine Shorty has told you that I was promoted, but again, I cannot tell you my new job and what I'm doing. We pass a lot of jokes here about the Army, and someday I'll tell you why, but unable to now, as I may catch hell from the officer who censors this letter. And Cook wrote in 1943, the censors don't hold up letters. They can only keep those letters for 24 hours and then must send them on if they don't have a chance to censor them at all. That's a very strict rule, I'm told. Well, actually, I'm not sure that was a rule at all. Sebastianok, writing to his sister, says, I don't write often, but I write plenty. That is, you get what's left after the censor gets through with it. You get some, and the censor gets some, and I get hell for writing something I'm not supposed to. You want to remember, no news from me is good news, for if anything serious happens to me, you will hear about it from the War Department. So don't start worrying because of the lack of letters. And Thompson wrote on October 20th, 1944, did I ever tell you I got a letter from you at home that had been censored? I think it was some knucklehead spot checking the mail. He also talked about Vmail that we're going to look at in a moment. And he said, when you write a Vmail, if you ever do, be sure and don't write over the margin. They won't print them then, and it takes a long time to get here. I got one that was 6 weeks old, and they had stamped in the corner to advise correspondence of such information. So you get an idea. There were lots of views about censor. Let's see if there's anything else here. We'll just go with those, I think, on censorship. That gives you an idea of the flavor of censorship. I have many more quotes where soldiers talked about censorship. Now, Vmail. I wanted to talk about Vmail. Vmail was something that many people used, but a lot of people did not like. And they didn't like it because they would be, you'd take a full-size letter and it would be filmed and then reprinted, and it would come out a quarter of its original size. So here's a poster from the government, again, trying to encourage people to use Vmail. Excuse me, the reason why you needed Vmail is think about the ships that were needed for, sending supplies or troops or food, equipment. Everything is needed on these ships. And yet, what did we say the number one thing soldiers wanted? Mail. So the government knew they had to send the mail too. And yet mail, when you have 16 million people in uniform during World War II, mail is going to take up a lot of space. So they came up with Vmail, and you would take a special Vmail form. And you see at the bottom here, by the way, it says it's private, reliable, and patriotic, because by reducing the size of the original letter, you're making a lot of space in those ships and planes for other things. So here's an example on the left of an original Vmail. That's the original that you write on the actual Vmail form. That would be filmed, and then the original letter would be kept overseas. The film would come across the ocean in a mail sack, and then once it crossed the ocean, whether coming home or going to Europe, it would then be printed out in this smaller version that you see that's about a quarter of the size there on the right. Again, because they were smaller, they were a little more difficult to read, but the government said, look, Vmail saves space, that's why it's patriotic, and it's the only guaranteed way to get your letter across, because if that letter is destroyed, if the film is destroyed in this case, or if you've sent it regular mail and the ship sinks, that letter's lost. But here, because they saved the original film, a copy of it, or the original letter, they can refilm it and send it across again, which they promised to do until the letter got delivered. So it was the only 100% guaranteed way to get mail across. Here's an example of a couple other Vmails, and a lot of them were ones that were sort of pre-designed that you could send for special occasions, like Easter or Mother's Day or Christmas. And this one is in our collection to Mrs. Rachel Rudd in Moseley, Virginia, and it is a Mother's Day greeting from the China-Burma India Theater. Well, real quick, I want to go through some patriotic covers, and those are envelopes. Remember Pearl Harbor was a huge phrase from the war. And if you look really carefully at the envelope on the left, the American flag has the word free in the flag. And again, on the upper corner, a serviceman's mail would have free written in it. So there they've actually put it in the stamp of the flag, the ink stamp. And then here's another one from Cleveland that, again, shows some ships, says, remember Pearl Harbor. Here's a patriotic cover that shows our enemy's flags, with a dagger, and it says, it shall be done. What I love about this is that the stamp is upside down, and if you didn't know it, an upside down stamp is a secret code for the phrase, I love you. A lot of the mail on the back would have SWAK, which meant sealed with a kiss. And I've seen some that say SWAK AML, which is sealed with a kiss, all my love. So people would write with their little codes. By the way, I'm not going to go into great detail about it today, but remember that these letters were not written for us to read. They were written as private conversations, often between a husband and wife, or a parent and a child. And frequently a husband and wife, they wanted to be romantic with each other in their letters, but they knew that the censor would be reading the mail. And, if you know that your lieutenant's reading the mail, how romantic do you really want to get? So quite often they would develop secret codes within their letters that really meant romantic things. And I remember in the Thompson letter collection that we have, they actually named their body parts, which I did not realize at first. I thought that that was their children they were talking about, until one day, of all people, one of my students figured out that it was a secret code for something other than family. So interesting how people would put secret codes into letters. Here's a patriotic cover for the V for victory. We have Winston Churchill there on the right giving the V sign for victory. And on the left, a patriotic cover where you see the searchlights, that are in the shape of a V. And then Miss Liberty, again, in the shape of a V with her arms and also with her hands. On to victory for liberty. Here's a patriotic one that shows the United Nations. Now, this is before the UN existed, which is kind of interesting, but it's the United Nations, the Allies, clearing the tracks of Hitler, Tojo, and Mussolini. Here's one that, again, not very flattering, but it shows Tojo with a bomb going off behind him, and it says bonds by bombs. Here's the Russian bear tearing at Hitler, and it says he's the man with the bear behind as it rips at his clothing. Here's one, our pledge, liberty and justice for all, as we try to liberate those in those countries that have been taken over by the Axis powers. One from Luxembourg. Now, this is an American one with an American stamp, but it was honoring Luxembourg, a nation at that point that was still under Nazi occupation in 1943. But it says Luxembourg is crushed but will live again. And if you don't realize it, Luxembourg played a huge role in getting America involved in the war, because when Luxembourg was taken over in 1940, Duchess Charlotte escaped and came to the United States. And President Franklin Roosevelt had Duchess Charlotte of Luxembourg travel around the US in 1940 and early 41, explaining the importance of America getting involved in the war. So Herbert Silcox wrote this very short letter. He was in the 38th Armored. Here's a photograph of him. He was a Virginian here in Richmond. And he said, Dear Herbert Gene, received your welcome letter dated February 23rd. Oh, actually, got to reverse this. This is being written to the soldiers. This is written to Herbert Gene from his father. And it says, received your welcome letter February 23rd. Glad you're getting along fine. Reading about the good job you were doing and hope it will be over soon. Yesterday, we worked in the yard. Seemed like spring, but it was rather cold. We all wish you the best and send lots of love. Write when you can, Dad. And what's so tough about this? March 11th, we're less than 2 months away from the end of the war, but that letter came back, and you can see here marked on the outside, it said deceased. And Lieutenant Silcox had died on the 29th of March in Kirchen, Germany, as a result of a shell fragment. He was wounded in the head. So anyhow, really difficult to get that information back from the government explaining that their son had been killed. I mentioned that they encourage people to write about things soldiers liked. So the Wilsons lived up towards Charlottesville, and on September 30th, 1942, she said, I wish you could have been here with me today listening to the World Series. After thinking the Dodgers were practically a cinch to win, the St. Louis Cards came from behind to place first. The Yankees feel quite at home playing in the series. And she listened to the series on the radio in 1942 every day and would write to him about who the players were that were doing well and what the scores of the games were. And it was quite exciting. Here, Carlton Cook said in 1942, I always have you in my heart and mind, darling. We must both look forward with faith and with the belief that someday soon We will have peace again, and you will be back safely. Oh, that's Jeanette writing to Carlton. Ike Lipton and Louise Ray, 2 letters, just brief, where they were going back and forth to each other. They were dating. She was in college in North Carolina, and Ike wrote to her in early 1945. It wasn't dated, but he said, "I'm safe. That is all I can say. Write to me if you have time, whether or not you get a letter from me or not. I will be seeing you every day in my dreams. Goodbye till I see you again, Ike Lipton." And Louise Ray wrote, "I was really glad to hear from you. I don't hear from you very often, but it really seems good when I do hear. I hope you weren't hurt very much. War is terrible, but still we back home can't realize what it is. Louise Ray." Well, that letter from Louise Ray was returned, and Ike also had died from his war wounds, and she found out on the outside of the envelope. A couple letters that really show the difficulty about writing that's going to lead up to my conclusion here today were written by Medic Jack King. And these are right at the early days as the Battle of the Bulge is getting ready to start here. So December 14th, "Dear Mom, I've been quite busy lately and haven't had a chance to write very much. If you don't hear from me so often these days, don't worry, everything's okay, but my time is pretty well occupied." So, he's letting her know that he's busy, but don't worry if you don't hear anything. Well, now the battle has started, and on December 22nd, he says, "I haven't written for several days. There's no time for it. In the past 4 days, I've had some very exciting experiences. Suffice it to say now that the war drew very close to me, but I'm still fine and dandy. This bunch of fellows I'm with is at its best in a tight spot. I have a great deal of faith in them. I believe we could pull through anything. Write often and don't worry, everything is okay. Love, Jack." And these are some of Jack's photos. Jack's in the upper left, and then some of the nurses that he was working with at the 47th Field Hospital over there in Europe. On the 27th, he writes, "Just a few days after Christmas, been a little while since I've had a chance to write. Things have been a bit unsettled here lately." So again, he can't write about what was really going on during the Battle of the Bulge. And then Christmas came along. He says the Army had fresh eggs for us on Christmas morning. So, he says he just prays that this will be a big victory for them, the counterattack, and that the war will end soon. And on January 2nd, rather, he writes, "Haven't had a chance to write. We moved about for quite a time. The Battle of the Bulge is still going." He says, "But now we're fairly well situated. Lately, we haven't been very stable. We've been to 6 places since we left the place I stayed so long, and only for a day or two. So they're frequently moving. And imagine that, having to pack up all the patients, all the equipment, and move to a new location. But things were so unsettled during the Battle of the Bulge that they had to frequently move." And then he mentions here, "Your letter of December 11th arrived last night. Of course, when we move, the mail gets messed up." He said, "It'll straighten out soon, I hope." Well, the mail got really messed up, and Christmas packages got so far behind that 6 airplane hangars of packages were waiting to be delivered. They were not able to deliver them because of the Battle of the Bulge. And the solution for that is going to be the 6th AAA Postal Directory Battalion, headed by Major Charity Adams. And this is the 6th AAA marching in England. What is so unique about them is that the 6th AAA is made up of an entirely female, entirely African-American group of soldiers. They were in the Women's Army Corps, and they were led by Major Charity Adams, who was also African-American. So again, the only completely all African-American unit to serve overseas during the war. And their job was to solve this problem. Remember, we said soldiers wanted their mail more than anything else, and morale depended on it. So the 6th AAA was sent to the rescue, and their job was to sort through the mail. Now, they are currently up for a Congressional Gold Medal, and it has already passed in the Senate, but it has not yet passed in the House of Representatives. And it's House of Representatives Bill 1012. So I'd love for you to contact your representative and say, "Hey, really like you to vote for the 6th AAA to receive the Congressional Gold Medal." So here's some of the information from the actual act itself. And the purpose is to award a gold medal to the members of the Women's Army Corps who were assigned to the 6th AAA Central Postal Directory Battalion. On July 1st, 1943, President Roosevelt signed into law legislation that established the Women's Army Corps as a component of the Army. The Women's Army Corps was converted from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which had been created in 1942 without official military status. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of the National Council of Negro Women, advocated for the admittance of African American women into the newly formed Women's Army Corps to serve as officers and enlisted personnel. While Army officials reported a shortage of qualified postal officers within the Eastern Theater of Operations, which resulted in a backlog of undelivered mail. As Allied forces drove across Europe, the ever-changing locations of service members hampered the delivery of mail to those service members. Because 7 million civilians and military personnel from the United States served in the Eastern Theater of Operations, many of those individuals had identical names. For example, 7,500 such individuals were named Robert Smith. One general predicted that the backlog in Birmingham, England would take 6 months to process, and the lack of reliable mail was hurting morale. The 688 created effective processes and filing systems to track individual service members, organize undeliverable mail, determine the intended recipient for insufficiently addressed mail, and handle mail addressed to service members who had died. Adhering to their motto of no mail, low morale, the women processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift and cleared the 6-month backlog of mail within 3 months. They worked around the clock in 3 shifts every day. This is Mabel Ortiz of the 688, and she is sitting on some of the mail bags that are in one of the hangars that they were working with. They just did an amazing job. I often read soldiers' letters that say, that, hey, by March of 1945, I got 10 letters today in one day in one batch of mail. And the soldiers were well aware that the mail was flowing again, but what they were not aware of, that it was the ladies of the 6888 that were getting the job done. So I think it's important, as important as the mail was to our loved ones, it's just as important to thank those who made sure that mail got delivered. So if you get a chance, look online. If you just Google 6888 Postal Battalion Gold Medal, all the information will come up. And I think it would be wonderful, while 4 of these ladies are still living, if we could have them receive the Congressional Gold Medal. I think that would just be terrific. So that's my presentation. By the way, this is a letter that was mailed from New York to Switzerland, and it was undeliverable, and it went back to New York. It took it 1.5 years to make it. It went through enemy territory, and you can see that it was examined by the Americans on the left. It was cut open by the Germans on the right, and it traveled all over Europe. I wish I had the letter, but I don't. All I have is the envelope, but that tells a story in and of itself. So thank you all for listening today, and are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Jim. That was so informative. You had a lot of information in there. Great presentation, and we do have a number of comments. Before we jump into that, thank you for all the information about the 6888, because I do think it's a story that most people have never heard of. These incredible women, they worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, broken into 3 shifts each day. It's just incredible what they were able to do. And I'm so glad you highlighted that today. And for those who may not know, there are 4 women buried at the American Normandy Cemetery, and 3 of them are from the 6888. So again, fascinating story, and so glad that you shared that. So thanks for that. And also we had Megan Hampshire, who said that she learned a lot. And I think this is true for a lot of people, not just in World War II, learned a lot from the letters that her grandfather wrote to her grandmother during World War II. She said, sadly, he died long before I was born. So those letters gave me a snippet of the kind of guy he was. And I think that's true, don't you? That oftentimes if we do, in a family who may not have had an opportunity to know much about that particular, whether it was their father or grandfather, this gives you a real just insight into their personality and their world at the time.
It really does. And, our project at school, we were dealing with about 8,000 original letters when I was teaching high school. And we put them on a website called ittookawar.com. And the reason why we called it It Took a War was because in the very first collection we acquired at the school, a woman from Utica, New York, named Sophia Socha, wrote to her husband, Stanley, that I can't believe it took a war for me to realize how much I love you. There must be millions like us, dear. And there were millions like them. But one thing I wanted to share was that we put these online and we were contacted by someone in Pennsylvania who said, you've got my dad's letters, and my father died when I was 7 years old. So I'm coming to know my dad through your project. And she was so excited that we were honoring her dad in that way.
That is so important. It truly is. Like I said, you just learn so much. Yes, that's terrific. And I wanted to ask you, because you talked a lot about letters that came back marked deceased. Do we have any idea how many or what percentage of families actually learned about a loved one who was serving through the letters that were returned prior to them actually getting official notification? Do you know?
I have never seen any fact, and I don't know that that's been measured, but I just think, we often, you see in the movies, there's always the car pulling up out front, and the door. And some of our letters, actually, there was a very beautiful series of letters written between a mother and the girlfriend of a soldier who was killed in the Pacific. And she writes that every time she would go past the door, she sees the Western Union man at the door with that telegram saying her son had been killed. And finally, she said she just couldn't even stay in the house anymore. And she moves. They just can't stay there. But you see that, but we don't ever really talk much about these letters coming back, that say killed in action or deceased on the outside. And I just think how horrible. I mean, there's a beautiful letter written from a neighbor, and he's writing to his neighbor who was in the military. And he basically says, I know I've never told you, but you're my best friend. And, I miss you so much. And that letter came back marked deceased. And he had actually written the letter, the original letter. He wrote it 2 days after the soldier had been killed. But of course, he had no idea that he had been killed. And, so it's difficult no matter what. But, we're happy here at the War Memorial. As we talk about letters, we have over 12,000 names of Virginians who have died in combat. And we want it to be more than just names and dates. We want to acquire photographs. We want to acquire letters, even if it's just copies of letters, so that we can put them in our database and really, develop who these people were and honor their memory. So if anyone does have letters of people who are from Virginia that were killed in battle, check our website and see if they're part of our shrine, and see if you can contact us. I mean, please do contact us about sharing some information that we can add so that it's more than just a name.
That's great. And have you come across letters that actually complained about the use of Vmail? Because I know that I think there was a limit to how much you could write due to Vmail, right? And I guess it
was limited.
You couldn't have a lot of include inserts or things like that in them. And so do you find letters that actually complain about the use of email?
I'm sure there are some, but what really stands out for me, I mentioned that I had interviewed a lot of World War II veterans, and they were the ones who really complained about Vmail. They hated Vmail. But you had to appreciate its purpose, to save room in those ships and planes. We had an interesting letter that was a half letter that was Canadian, and it was burned. And it said, it was stamped right on it, destroyed or damaged in an air crash, it said on the letter. So it was true that, there was no guarantee your mail was going to make it to you unless you used Vmail, and they could pretty much guarantee that.
That's right. Well, a lot of compliments coming in, Jim. I'm sure some from people including the Battle of the Bulge Association, who thanks you for your presentation and what a great job you did. Many people just thanking you for putting these letters together in a wonderful summary of just really their stories show, as Betty Rose here says, their personal stories really demonstrate the impact of the war on their lives. It's such an insight for us to sit back and read that and hear from them directly, especially when we don't have, obviously now many of our World War II veterans are gone. That generation is leaving us. So to be able to have these letters is such a treasure.
I fully agree. Their voices, keeping those voices alive after their passing, and their memories alive. I just think it's so vital. And it begs the question then: what about our military personnel today who doesn't write handwritten letters? What will we have in the future? So I just encourage everybody. It's still not that expensive to send a letter. Once in a while, write a letter. Just write a handwritten letter. So anyhow.
Well, your presentation was wonderful, and I echo what you said. It's so important to recognize, the 688th and all of the work that they did. Their achievement was truly remarkable to do what they did in 3 months' time. They were so successful, and they came back home, and they did not get the recognition they deserved. They didn't really talk about it, and I think it's so important that we share their incredible story and pass it along to others. And it really showed an amazing achievement during World War II. As you said, getting mail to service personnel was incredibly important, and keeping that morale up. And it's important that we recognize their contributions. So thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. And do know that although they were in England, beginning in February of 1945, they were still in harm's way. The war was still going on for England too. They would move over to France later in the spring, but yeah, they're doing their work there in England in 45. But you're very welcome, and it's been an honor. I love the National D-Day Memorial, and hope that I can come visit you soon.
We would love it. I know that we work together quite a bit in our educational programming, and we have just great working relationship between our two memorials and all that we do. So we encourage everyone to check out both of our websites and learn more, and tell others about the 688th and share their story. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Jim, we hope you'll come back and share some more stories with us. We really enjoyed having you.
Thank you, April. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.